And so it is actually 5:30, and I want to make sure I'm giving y'all as much time as possible, especially for that Q&A at the end. So we can go ahead and get started.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Annie.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead and get my screen share up here. All right, awesome. Welcome, everyone. We're going to go, just like Annie said, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our session. I think this is N as in November 2. And myself and my co-presenter will go first, and then we'll be followed by Thomas and Emily, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. So thanks again for coming. My name is Nainapit Limlamai. The first T is silent, as is the H. And I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Michigan in the Joint Program in English and Education. My primary research interest is teacher preparation. So I study secondary English teacher preparation and how that can be related to justice and how that moves from university preparation into student teaching classrooms. And my interest in writing across the curriculum is involved in how students develop pedagogical content knowledge. So I'm going to let my co-presenter, Emily, introduce herself, and then we will get right into it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Wilson. Sorry I can't join you live, but it's 2:30 in the morning here in Saudi Arabia, and I just got over jet lag, so I decided a video would be best. I graduated from the Joint Program in English and Education at the University of Michigan in 2019. And since then, I've been an assistant professor of English at Al Faisal University here in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Last year, I started a writing center at the university. And then last semester, I piloted a writing to learn program in organic chemistry. I'm going to begin the presentation today by just giving you a quick overview of what we'll be discussing. So the data that we're going to share with you today is from a qualitative study of 15 undergraduate writing fellows. These are writing-focused peer tutors who work in large undergraduate gateway courses at the University of Michigan, courses that have implemented the MWrite project, a writing to learn program. Our research has evolved a little bit since we first did the proposal for this session. At first, we were interested in how the writing fellows' work changed their view of the content. And then we realized what was actually interesting was how they were talking about pedagogical content knowledge, the kind of knowledge that they needed in order to teach something. So the program guide for this session states that this is a study of the learning experienced by disciplinary specialist fellows in STEM fields. That is still true, but now it's about how these fellows talked about ways that 3 kinds of listening helped them develop pedagogical content knowledge. So Nainapit is going to give you a little bit of theoretical background. She's going to go through our framework. I'll come back to discuss some of our major findings from this study. And then Nainapit will close out by discussing implications for writing fellows in writing to learn programs and novice instructors more generally.
All right. So like Emily said, I'll be talking about what is pedagogical content knowledge and 3 kinds of listening, and exploring the relationship between the 2 ideas. At its very most basic form, pedagogical content knowledge is knowledge for teaching, is content knowledge, knowledge of the discipline, and knowledge of disciplinary ways of knowing, right? Pedagogical content knowledge is very special because only instructors, only teachers have to have this kind of knowledge, right? Like any person on the street can understand, maybe the plot of a novel or how to perform a simple mathematical equation, but only teachers have this special ability, special skill that they hone to be able to understand how to explain that content knowledge to a learner. And on the surface, it just looks like it's these 2 things, right? Knowledge of content and knowledge of disciplinary ways of knowing. But disciplinary knowledge is actually made up of 2 other kinds of knowledge. It's made up of knowledge of pedagogy or knowledge of teaching and knowledge of students. So we're actually working with 3 different kinds of knowledge when we think about pedagogical content knowledge. The first, and this is just presented in any random order, is knowledge of content, right? So what is the knowledge that is in the discipline? So when I say that you're doing math, what does that mean that you're doing, right? It's knowing the landscape of the field as well. What we know about people who know their discipline very well is that they know it very deeply and very widely, especially how the relationship between ideas that sometimes seem totally different or disparate to novice learners. Finally, it's understanding disciplinary ways of knowing. So what counts as knowledge in the field and who produces that kind of knowledge? The second piece of information that makes up pedagogical content knowledge is knowledge of pedagogy. So these, as it's very basic, is just teaching strategies, right? Teaching strategies for any generic learner. We're not yet looking at specific learners. It's thinking about what ideas and concepts to introduce, when and how, right? As a disciplinary specialist, you're not going to begin with the most advanced ideas with your most novice learners. So how do you know when to introduce different ideas? And how do you know how to introduce those ideas? Knowledge of pedagogy involves thinking about how novices take up ideas, where they have misconceptions, what teaching strategies are particularly productive, right? You may know that a particular teaching strategy is really productive in this one concept for organic chemistry. That's knowledge of pedagogy. And then finally, how to select examples and non-examples. So it's just as important to know kind of a example problem set that you would like to offer students as it is to say, oh, I'm going to stay away from this problem set because it brings on misconceptions. It highlights misconceptions. The final piece of pedagogical content knowledge is knowledge of students. And this is particular knowledge of the people who are right in front of you. So knowledge of pedagogy is just kind of generic teaching strategies. Knowledge of students is with this particular group of learners who's in front of me with their backgrounds and their identities. What are some teaching strategies that I know that are going to be productive for them? It's the ability, because you're a content specialist, to anticipate what's going to be both confusing and motivating for a particular group of learners, and being able to head that off. It's the ability to interpret student thinking. So when they say something that you don't expect, it's the ability to listen to that and say, what's going on here? And then finally, it's being able to imagine learning a disciplinary concept from the point of view of these particular learners in front of you. So there's a high level of empathy involved here, because oftentimes as disciplinary specialists, we don't remember what it's like to know as a novice, right? It's that almost like the idea of threshold concepts. Like there are things we know that we cannot unknow, but that novices don't yet know. So it's knowledge of students is being able to see the content from their point of view. All right, I'm going to toggle over to talk about 3 kinds of listening, and then I'll put them together. So there are 3 different kinds of listening that we investigated in terms of the extent to which they developed pedagogical content knowledge. And the first kind of listening is evaluative. In evaluative listening, you're looking for a particular answer rather than to a particular speaker. So you're so focused on what their answer is going to be that you're not actually listening to the human being who's talking in front of you. When you listen for a particular answer, if you're listening evaluatively, you tend to ignore why a speaker would say what they did, right? You're just kind of like, well, that's wrong, but here's the right answer, and we're just going to move on. The next kind of listening is interpretive listening. In interpretive listening, the learner responds in a way that the instructor does not anticipate. And the instructor uses this response to shape their teaching. And that's the important part. They use the response to shape their teaching. Because, I mean, to be honest, how many times can we actually anticipate what's going to come out of a student's mouth, right? Like that's one of the magical things and scary things about teaching, is that literally they can say anything. So for this, as you're listening interpretively, you're actually listening to their response and you're thinking, well, why did they say what they're saying? What makes them say that? And you're using their response to shape your teaching. So a very basic example of this. Say that you are teaching math and you ask a learner, what is 3 times 2? And the answer they give you is 5. So you're thinking, wait a minute, that is not the correct answer, right? But instead of saying, no, that's wrong, and let's move on, you're thinking about, well, why would they say 5? And then you think, oh, because they're adding 3 plus 2 instead of multiplying 3 plus 2. Excuse me, multiplying 3 times 2. So when they say 5, you as the instructor can try to see what is the gap, and then you ask the learner what's happening. So you might say something like, can you show me how you got 5 from 3 times 2? Could you show me your work? And usually through that process, the learner says, oh, I was doing 3 plus 2 rather than 3 times 2. This is a simple example, but you can see, I think it illustrates how you as the instructor can say, well, what's going on with that learner? Let me use the learner's response to shape my next response to them. This kind of listening builds pedagogical strategies. Okay. The final kind of listening, the most advanced kind of listening, is hermeneutic listening. In the same way as an interpretive, the learner responds in a way that the instructor does not anticipate. But the key difference between interpretive and hermeneutic listening is that the learner solves a problem in a novel way that the instructor has not yet considered. That's the really important distinction, that there's the learner says a response and the instructor says, the instructor might say, well, how did you get that? Like, show me your thinking and how you're thinking about that idea. And the learner walks the instructor through the process, and the instructor comes out of that saying, I have never thought about the content in that way, or I've never thought about this as a way to do something. And the roles flip, right? The learner becomes the instructor and the instructor becomes the teacher. And this is why I think that hermeneutic listening is the most exciting, but it's also the scariest, because you're literally flipping your role. So depending on your stance as the instructor, you may feel threatened that a student is teaching you. You may feel threatened that maybe you haven't considered this problem in this way. But this kind of listening builds your knowledge of the content, right? So you are learning more about the content as you develop this kind of knowledge. So what's the relationship between pedagogical content knowledge and listening? So what our article research is showing, what we found in these interviews with these writing fellows, is that interpretive listening and hermeneutic listening developed instructors' knowledge of students and their understanding of course content. That led to their development of pedagogical strategies in which they could help support students' learning. So I'm going to turn it back over to Emily, Video Emily, who will use the framework to share some of our really key and really important, interesting findings.
Hi, I'm back to discuss with you some of the findings from our study. So we really focused on how we saw interpretive and hermeneutic listening shaping the fellows' pedagogical content knowledge. Our first finding was that for these writing fellows, interpretive listening was shaping their knowledge of teaching. And we saw 3 processes involved with interpretive listening. First, we saw the fellows listening to how students were making sense of the content. A lot of times students would respond in unanticipated ways to course material, and the writing fellows would listen closely. And then in the second part of that process, they would use that knowledge to shape their response. So they would figure out where the student was coming from, where those misconnections were. And then ultimately, they would use that understanding to craft an accessible, understandable explanation that would reach the student. So here's a quote from writing fellow Taylor that illustrates interpretive listening and how it shapes pedagogical content knowledge in action. Taylor says, "Sometimes when I was going through examples with students, there were times when they would get it right away, and sometimes they would notice the patterns, but then sometimes they keep asking questions, and you realize, okay, there's something, it's just not connecting as well." So then that's kind of when I started realizing, okay, Maybe I need to come up with a different example really quick, or I'll just try to use some previous examples that I'd heard of from my lecture. So I would just kind of try to use those. In this quote, we can see all three interpretive listening processes at work. First, Taylor is listening to how students are making sense of the content. He is learning things from their questions. If they don't get it right away, he is not looking for one particular answer. He's open to a variety of answers, and he's using those as data, as information to inform his response. So that's what he's doing here. He's saying, okay, there's something that's not connecting. He's figuring out what that is. And then ultimately, he's returning to pedagogy. He creates a different example real quick as he listens interpretively to students to ascertain where precisely they missed the connection. He is also simultaneously developing pedagogical content knowledge, developing knowledge of how to teach, how to reach students. Here's another example of interpretive listening at work from writing fellow Tamra. Tamra says, I had to find a lot of ways to explain things to myself that made sense for me, but it was especially solidified when I had to interact with 90 students that were all at different points in their academic career, at different points in the course. And understanding their level of understanding was completely different from each other. I didn't really have to think about how to give them that feedback until I was a writing fellow, and we had to think of different ways to give them that information. The whole process of developing pedagogical content knowledge is developed by the number of students that writing fellows interact with, as they have to listen to students, to use their responses to shape an understanding, and then create different ways to reach them. And as they do this over and over and over again, as Tamra says, with 90 students who are all coming at the material from slightly different angles, then that helps with the development of their PCK. They're listening interpretively over and over and over again and thinking of different ways to give the information. Our second finding is that hermeneutic listening shapes knowledge of content, and not just any knowledge of content, but the kind of knowledge of the content, the way you need to know it in order to teach it. Hermeneutic listening starts with a stance. The fellow approaches the students from a stance of curiosity and openness. And very importantly, the writing fellow views students as sense makers. Partly, this is due to writing fellows' proximity to students. It's not very long since they themselves have been students in the class. So they're more inclined than perhaps a seasoned professor to view this student as bringing valuable knowledge to the table, an asset-based approach. And so they're willing and very open to listening to them. Second, the fellows and the students then negotiate meaning together. So the writing fellow's knowledge of the content is being shaped by these sessions in which the fellow and the student together are negotiating meaning. And then ultimately, of course, this new knowledge of the content is informing the writing fellow's pedagogy. Here's a quote from writing fellow Aiden that really beautifully illustrates the power of hermeneutic listening and how it develops pedagogical content knowledge. Aiden says, sometimes you realize that you learned from the questions that the students would ask you in office hours, because you realize you've never thought about that aspect of the scenario or the physical concept. Then it pushes you to think about that, which kind of makes you think more and more deeply about the concepts. So you learn from questions that you get from office hours. Because students can come up with very different questions, like gauging where they are, gauging how they think about the concept, because that's totally different than how we talk about the concept, because we know the answer, right? We're really focused on that answer. And we know that that's 100% what we're expecting, but we ignore all the other possibilities when we're answering those questions, right? So sometimes we end up changing the rubric so that, oh, actually, the way that student thought about it is actually right too. So we can add that to the rubric too, because that's not wrong. We just never thought about it that way. So here we see, first of all, that Aiden knows what an open stance looks like. He describes sort of the opposite of an open stance when he says that sometimes we get too focused on the right answer and ignore all other possibilities. And he is arguing instead for a more open stance that considers alternate possibilities. We also see how he is negotiating meaning with students. He is learning from them and allowing his own thinking about the course content to be pushed, to be moved forward by their questions. And then finally, we see his new content knowledge informing his pedagogy. He returns to the rubric. Aiden is describing, without even realizing it, the development of his pedagogical content knowledge. He is open to letting his interactions with students change his thinking. He shows that his thinking is highly flexible, and his pedagogical content knowledge is directly influenced by the hermeneutic listening that he does. Hi, I'm back to discuss with you.
Sorry about that. Okay. All right. So what does this mean for shaping our own teaching and then the training of TAs, writing fellows, peer tutors, anyone who has interactions with students via their writing? In terms of developing interpretive listening, Emily talked a lot about stance, right? That we see that students are actually sense makers. And this is kind of flattening the hierarchy oftentimes between learner and instructor. We want to be able to say, okay, what is our knowledge of content? And how do we think about that content differently? How do we think about students? How do we think about their questions based on what they're saying? And we want to use our knowledge of content and students to build our pedagogy. In terms of developing hermeneutic listening, we start with the same idea of stance. The students are sense makers. This one is also a little bit, and I want to use the word again intentionally, dangerous, because we're trying to say, as an instructor, I may know the content, but you, the learner, also have a measure of expertise in which you can relate to me more about the content as well. And I can learn more about the content based on how you're thinking about it as oftentimes a novice. We're using new knowledge of content to develop our pedagogy. Oh, excuse me. I thought I had one more on there. But yeah, we're using this idea of knowledge of students, knowledge of content, and knowledge of pedagogy to develop our teaching, all informed by how we listen to students. I'm going to put this slide up, but I will also include our contact information during the Q&A period. And I can also drop it in the chat in case you want to touch base or have additional questions that we don't get to during the Q&A session. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Emily and Thomas.
That was great. I think we're actually going to hand it over to Annie because we pre-recorded our presentation. And,
that's right.
So she's going to play that video for us.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here.
Hello, thank you all to those of you who are watching this video. We very much appreciate your interest. My name is Tom Polk, and I direct the WAC program at George Mason, where I'm also a doctoral candidate, focusing on writing development and experiential learning.
And my name is Emily Stout. I will be the graduate assistant director of the same WAC program at GMU starting this fall. And I'm also a doctoral candidate focusing on TA professional development and identity.
Before we begin, we do want to offer a note about our original project that we proposed for this conference. That project didn't fully happen because of the COVID-19 pandemic, so we have adjusted our presentation today. That was about a TA development program, and today we are still talking about faculty and TA development, an idea that grew out of some research that we did a few years ago, or we began a few years ago, talking with faculty about their assignment design practices, and research that we returned to during the pandemic as we continue to adjust our operations as a program. That project, that research project, is locally known as the REV, or the Review Project, and it was started in 2015 by a former director, Michel France, to gain a better understanding of the campus climate with regards to writing instruction. And as we say that, we're really conscious of Cox, Gallen, and Meltzer's work on sustainable WAC programs, in which they describe a four-part methodology of developing and sustaining programs. The first part of that methodology really focuses on learning about the institutional landscape, particularly the ideologies that inform a campus culture of writing. So those scholars describe the methodology as recursive, progressing and returning through the stages of the methodology. And we think the REV project and how we've drawn on it in our program work really embodies this spirit as we return to the corpus of data that we have collected and use it to shape our programming and initiatives. Just as a quick example from this work, over the past few years, we've developed workshops and learning communities aimed at helping faculty better understand different paradigms for assigning writing. We've used these programs to also expand faculty notions of clarity in assignment design, shifting from something that we noticed was more of a document-based understanding of clarity to more of an interaction-based understanding. But we've also used this data to work at what Cox, Gallen, and Meltzer call the macro level of program work by developing new outcomes for our writing intensive and writing enriched courses that embed notions of writing to learn, writing to communicate, and WAC pedagogy really into those courses. And we're also working more closely with our general education program to more clearly articulate the implicit vertical curriculum that we and program partners believe to be visible, but learned perhaps wasn't so visible to other stakeholders around campus. And that's still ongoing work. Recently, and the focus of today's session, we've begun to look at our interview participants' discussion of their prior experiences with writing and the influences of those experiences on their instruction and assignment design practices. Specifically, we're looking at the responses of 10 faculty, which is about 1/6 of the full data set that we have for faculty interviews. Their responses to two questions. How did you learn to write as an academic or a professional in your field? And how did you learn to teach writing? Pretty standard questions in terms of WAC interviews or interviewing faculty. We use them as warm-ups, but we thought their answers were pretty rich. And so we wanted to dig into them. We noticed particularly, and maybe somewhat predictably, the faculty responses flowed between these two questions without much of a sense of a boundary between them. That is, faculty would answer one while responding to another, such as one participant telling us that they really learned to write an academic report when they began teaching it, or another faculty member telling us that they learned to teach writing by observing their faculty in graduate school. So responses like these have really prompted us to think about the varied ecological factors that influence writing instruction and begin to see faculty pedagogical development like faculty literacy development. Anyway, so what we did for today is to take these 10 participant responses and code them in 3 layers. First, we wanted to document the actual site of development. Second, we wanted to understand if this development was intentional or tacit, what we call cognitive or social apprenticeship. Third, we documented the actual interaction that promoted or enabled development. So our first table shows the locations of development in the first 4 columns across the top. The last 2 columns indicate whether that development was intentional, what we call cognitive apprenticeship, following Collins, Brown, and Newman, or tacit, what we call social apprenticeship following Beaufort. The top row indicates how many times each of these codes was mentioned, and the bottom row indicates how many participants referred to that specific code. And what we found most interesting about this table is the prevalence of social apprenticeship. That is, tacit learning was mentioned more frequently than intentional learning, and it was mentioned by all participants, whereas intentional learning or cognitive apprenticeship was not. On the next slide, we offer a couple of examples to illustrate what we were seeing. So from participant 9, we see her referencing reading in her master's program, right? She says, I think that a lot of it just came from reading a lot of things in my master's of public health program that were, lots and lots of documents that were written in our own particular public health kind of style. We coded this schooling graduate cognitive apprenticeship because she's referring to an activity with primarily a developmental intent, and mentor text because the interaction between her and the text is sort of the primary interaction that promotes development. Participant 1 is a little bit of a different experience. This person says, I was involved with writing several professional documents in the lab that I was in, government contracts. We wanted to know information about this, and we would do that research and then prepare reports. So I was involved in writing those in my first year and basically learned to write by doing. So we coded this schooling as well, right? Graduate schooling and social apprenticeship because the person is referring to an activity primarily focused on research, and collaboration because the interaction that person is having with peers seems to be the thing really promoting the development. And so below those participant responses, we offer a table that digs just a little bit more into the second layer of our codes, cognitive and social apprenticeships. And we just want to say this is something that we're still working on, so maybe bear with us. Again, across the top, we have 4 sites that we saw in our data in the column headers across the top. And the top row shows how many times a cognitive apprenticeship was connected to each site. And the bottom row shows how many times a social apprenticeship was connected to each site. And what this helps us to see is that tacit learning has a significant impact across each of these sites, including schooling. Right, this finding likely doesn't surprise anyone, particularly those of you who are doing lots of faculty development work, but coding these 3 layers really helped us to think about and to see what Russell and others have referred to as the transparency of writing and the transparency of writing development. So Emily has been really interested in helping faculty unpack that idea of transparency. And so she's going to talk a little bit about some of her dissertation work that connects to that idea.
One particular influence we noted in the data from the REV project that Tom has been discussing was a repeated mention of how one's graduate studies influence how one teaches writing. As Wizenreed describes in this quote, because TAs often carry the pedagogical strategies and practices they develop in their graduate school teaching experiences into their future faculty positions, it is in the best interest of WAC programs and institutions as a whole to support TA's development in ways that benefit not only their current students, but also future students. So WAC scholars have pointed to the importance of TA development, particularly ones that help them surface what I will define later in this presentation as their ecologies of influence. And WAC's interest in TA development is well established for good reasons. TAs are essential to the success of classes in WAC programs because they're often responsible for teaching or grading writing for them. And for this reason, Tanya Rodrigue advocates that TAs should receive better, greater PD, such as mentoring, paired with evaluation. Michael Cripps et al. Also discusses the role of mentoring and reflection by describing the program of WAC fellowships and graduate student PD at SUNY. Former graduate students in that piece attest that time away from teaching allowed them a chance to reflect on their own pedagogy and mentoring offered them insights to university-wide systems beyond their own classrooms. This administrative mentoring responds to Michael Pemberton's call for the same. He believes that graduate students need explicit instruction in WPA work. Indeed, providing PD for TAs furthers their education and preparation for the job market, and it helps faculty and undergrad students. TAs are not often recognized as full-fledged instructors, however, but Wisenreed concludes that because TAs can wield their identities for the sake of teaching disciplinary writing to students, professional development should help them uncover the network of influences that impact them as instructors. Similarly, Bushnell and Gorman see the multiple roles TAs serve under as an asset to their disciplinary, interdisciplinary abilities when teaching undergraduate students. And from the fields of education and composition, there are several models of professional development. And we think these might help TAs build a sense of what influences their identity as instructors. So Scales et al. Focuses on new teacher development of professional judgment, and Fuller outlines changes in new teachers' concerns as they grow. However, Fessler paints a broader picture of their development, including a personal environment that, with an organizational environment, influences one's career cycle. He concludes from this model that teachers' development is dynamic, which changes the kinds of support that's best suited for them. This suggests that TAs would benefit from long-term developmental support, as Reed et al. Have argued, and that instructors need more comprehensive support. The question, of course, is how to do this within a program that is limited in the support it can provide. WAC scholars have pointed to the importance of TA development, as we've said, particularly TA development that helps them surface what we call their ecologies of influence. These ecologies of influence include the personal, professional, and situational factors, which over time influence their identity as instructors and their pedagogy in ways they may not be aware. This is our working definition. We believe by raising their awareness of these ecologies of influence, TAs can be more purposeful about seeking out PD to become the instructors they want to be. For their WPAs, it's helpful to understand the influences on their TAs so that they can offer more appropriate PD opportunities. And ecologies are a well-known term. We often use them to describe writing programs and the social networks that influence one's writing and writing processes. But the data we collected from the REV project may give us insight into networks of influence for WAC faculty. As we've mentioned, several spoke of the impact of graduate school on their developing writing pedagogy. So we're now going to turn to look at a particularly interesting participant's response and what these suggest about our evolving ecologies of influence model of PD, as well as potential interventions we might make based on these. Participant 2 speaks of the influence of faculty mentors in graduate school who offered feedback and mentoring. Along with this, they learned to write by reading and trial and error. They also speak of the value of revising and how helpful peer review can be. And as they reflect, they note how influential it was to have direct support in graduate school through a course in proposal writing and dissertation feedback. So this suggests that their interpersonal relationships, those with faculty and peers, which were in their social and cognitive apprenticeships, were key to developing as a writer and, as we will see, a writing instructor. In learning to teach writing, participant 2 predominantly points to their experience teaching as a graduate student. This faculty member passes on what helped them in grad school, and they adapt their experience to their students' needs. They recognize that what helped them personally to write, mentor texts, mentoring from graduate faculty, reading, revising, here we see again cognitive social apprenticeships. They recognize those, and they can theorize that this may also help their writing students, or students might have a different way of doing things. And as with learning to write, the faculty member lists trial and error, a sort of implicit learning here again, in the classroom as a means to finding what helps students write. They engage students in a way that shapes their pedagogy, as we see in this quote. A lot of times, the students were teaching me. I get a lot of feedback from the students as to what works for them and what doesn't. Here again, we see the influence of interpersonal relationships, instructor to student, vice versa. Elsewhere, we saw significant others influencing an instructor's teaching. And we also find a combination of social and cognitive apprenticeships. This messy combination affected their development as a writing instructor and correspondingly their writing pedagogy. We believe that helping instructors be more aware of this messy combination of social and cognitive apprenticeships can help them be more aware of how they teach and why, and how they might grow as instructors. For that reason, we are developing a series of reflective activities to situate instructors as they are. We intend to use them at the beginning of PD, and these could be used in professional development for instructors or TAs, because awareness of one's ecologies of influence is important for both. We will begin with reflective questions, such as those in the interview, at the beginning of a professional development session series or a learning community. These could also be adapted for regular reflection and responded to either in writing or discussion with other instructors. Next, we would use a Map Your Ecology graphic organizer as another reflective activity that helps instructors practically and visually lay out their ecology of influence. We see this as akin to Tyson Sawacki's contexts that influence assignment design and the evaluation of student writing, but their model focuses mostly on academic influences. Our model focuses on personal, professional, and situational influences that shape instructor identity and pedagogy. From these first two activities and faculty responses to them, we can theorize what typical influences are, present this model to faculty in a way that helps them make goals for how they want to grow in their instruction, and then connect that to upcoming program offerings. The remainder of those program offerings would add to their ecologies of influence. And in those offerings, we might expose them to different ways of teaching or teaching tools, as well as the reasoning behind the teaching methods they currently use. So in this way, we could use the power of faculty reflections to give them a greater sense of who they are as instructors and who they want to be, and align our program offerings in response. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions about this work during the discussion portion of this presentation.
Okay. Well, I think we've reached the Q&A portion here. We're a small but burly bunch, I think. So maybe just feel free to unmute and chat. But maybe I'll throw out a question while people are thinking or maybe composing their thoughts. I was just watching ours and I was thinking, Pit, about the trial and error, really kind of like the presentation that you all did and the research you're doing is really like, what is trial and error, right? Like, here's what it is. It's not really trial and error. It's like this whole sort of set of activities that are really robust and rich. And I'd be curious on your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think that, so my day job is I primarily think about working with pre-service secondary English teachers. I was a former English teacher before I came back to graduate school. And there's a lot of overlap, in what I saw. Emily, the co-presenter, was also a high school English teacher before coming back to graduate school. And there's a lot of overlap that we saw in how the fellows are talking about developing teaching strategies and the pre-service teachers that we were teaching, and then our own memories of learning how to teach and continually refining those strategies. I think there are impressions that teaching is very easy, right? We all know this narrative that teaching is very easy, oftentimes because we ourselves went to school. So we have this weird notion that I went to school, I could be a teacher. And then we also have this like narrative that teaching is, that we don't value teachers, that schooling is not very robust. And so you combine all these factors and it gives people the impression that, yeah, you just kind of like stand up there and do what you're going to do. And then osmosis, the students learn. But what we're hoping that our research does is to complicate that notion and make visible actual strategies and things that people are doing that facilitate student learning, right? One of the things that we wanted to continue to study in our next study is how this affects student outcomes, right? Like if you had a writing fellow who was very skilled in interpretive and hermeneutic listening, such that their pedagogical content knowledge was pretty sophisticated, to what extent does that make a difference in student learning? So yeah, we're trying to help develop a vocabulary and a set of strategies and a set of skills to say that, look, these are things that people who teach are good at and can do that people who do not teach or have not studied these ideas do poorly, or don't think about, and really make that separation because teachers are a special group of people. And I think that because we think differently about how students respond to things.
Yeah, Terry.
Yeah, I think, Tom, thinking about your question, which I think is a really good question, is that what you're doing, pronounce your name, Nafit?
Nana Pits. Nana like Dana, and then pit like a hole in the ground.
Nana Pit, thank you. Is that I think, I don't totally agree with something you said, because I think many teachers do that intuitively. So they haven't necessarily been taught to do it. It has to do with interpersonal communication styles, things like that. What I think your study is doing that's so good is that you are looking at investigating what's involved with that style. So that we can see the pieces of it. And Tom, I can't think of how you phrased that. It's like, there was a phrase you used there that was learning by trial and error or something. So that's like, okay, but what does that look like? And that's what I think you're giving us with your study. And then Tom, I think with the reflective questions that you're going to ask, I think about how reflective questions often then lead faculty to give different answers than they might have given, because now they've reflected on it. And so that makes changes too.
Yeah. I just finished a different set of interviews, as you know, Terry, and at the end of one, a faculty member was like, gosh, I hadn't thought about all of the stuff that was involved. And so it's not in the things that we were just talking about now, but yeah, they're those questions elicit a lot of that tacit knowledge. Yeah.
I want to say one more thing before I forget. And that is that I've gone to a lot of sessions in this conference so far, and the ones I've enjoyed the most are from the newer scholars who are doing this kind of work, that we can really see, because it's like, after a while, it's kind of mind numbing when you just hear, here's what we're doing in our program. And, this is what, why we're doing. And you're actually doing studies, which is really so interesting to hear.
Well, thank you. I can't speak for everyone else, but it means a lot to me for sure.
I'd just like to echo that. And also, you all need to publish every single part of this in lots of different journals until you get around to the book. Because seriously, I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, well, my writing fellows need to read this. My colleagues need to read this. I need to steal those questions. So, please do continue with this work. This is the kind of thing that moves the field on. And you're asking questions that I hadn't actually thought of asking. So thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up the thread of the reflective questions eliciting responses that are unexpected. And that's something Tom and I, and then myself with my committee, have talked about that the role of reflection in professional development, that it one of my interests is how much teachers reflect and what that looks like if it's on their own versus an intentional intervention. And the hunch there, right, is that it has to be an intervention, or not has to, but is more productive perhaps as intervention, that if it's deliberately in part of professional development asked, that it's going to elicit things that might not have come outside of that sort of interruption of the everyday process. But it's still really interesting to think about, that enduring interest of mine of like, well, what does this look like when teachers just carry it on their own? What does their reflection look like? How effective is it? I just wanted to highlight that part of what we're talking about in the sense of how much it needs to be something that comes about in their professional development versus something that's organic, so to speak, in their development.
I was also a high school English teacher for quite a number of years, yeah. And when I was teaching high school, and also when I first started teaching at the university, it was like, what is what's the secret to being a good teacher? And I always thought I was a pretty good teacher. And I thought, I just know how to teach. I just teach kind of who I am. And I never really had thought about it. And now, when I try to think about it, it's really still hard to get to what is that makes one a good teacher. And so again, I think that that's what these studies are trying to find out.
Yeah, I volunteered. I was a AmeriCorps, so I'm gonna give myself credit for it was an impactful year. It helped me figure some things out. I was actually kind of curious again, Nana Pitt, about sort of like the story of, because I was thinking about good teaching is also like good listening, I think is sort of a subtext. And like, how did you kind of move toward looking at listening in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And a note I wrote to my co-presenter was that we didn't have a method section like in our presentation. We just focused on the framework and the findings. I do a lot of research with math education folks, elementary and middle, primarily elementary and middle school math people. And so I was reading a study and came across this idea of listening in math classrooms, elementary math classrooms, and how that listening then shaped the teacher's response, then shaped student learning. And so I thought this is really fascinating. And I've always been intrigued by the idea about the extent to which teachers see students as sense makers. And what was really striking about the writing fellows was that across the board, every single one of them had that stance where they saw students as sense makers. And we wondered if it was potentially because they were so close in proximity to those students, right? Because the writing fellows have already taken the course and they are also undergraduates. And so they come back to work with undergraduates. And so oftentimes they're only maybe a semester, a year, a couple years out from where the undergraduates are. And so they have memory of what this was like learning it. And so kind of putting those things together, that's why I like interdisciplinary work, because it was in a completely different field that I happened upon, listening, and then kind of pieced it back together with what the writing fellows were doing. So that's kind of how it was pretty organic, I guess, how it came about. Yeah. And I'm always, my work itself thinks about like, yeah, what does a good teacher do? Mm-hmm. And how do they do it? And, it's hard to say like, well, here's the list. I know we're not looking for a checklist because every teacher is very different. It's that interpersonal relationship too with students. So that's additionally challenging of how do we come up with a set of principles maybe, or language that teachers use, that effective instructors use. With that.
The reason I ask, and I want to say this just before Catherine, then we'll get you open the mic up, is I had mentioned earlier, like this notion of clarity and assignment design came up in some of our interviews, and faculty were just so frustrated with this documents not being clear. And to me, it was like, the document's never going to be clear enough. It has to be interactive. Like, you need to shift your notion of clarity from that document toward that interaction. And listening is such a large part of that. Like, how are my students really taking to what I'm saying and really taking to the content, and how am I hearing that? I think, so yeah, it's great. But Catherine, the floor is yours.
Well, that is, sorry, my bandwidth keeps my video camera off here, but I've been enjoying this very much. But that morphs into what I was thinking of, your categories of the social and cognitive. I forget what the second word was there. And, at first I'm thinking, it seems a shame that the faculty felt, or the TAs felt, that they were learning sort of by the seat of their pants, that they were never taught it, that they had to learn it under fire. And my first thought is, well, geez, that means that the older faculty should, not be demanding that younger faculty learn and suffer, the way that we did, and instead should be trying to improve that path. But I think it just sort of occurred to me that this other fight that I'm fighting is this just-in-time instruction. So I teach a class in how to write it's a basic article for graduate students, article proposal, all the different stages. And I can just see them sort of fading away. So then I'm like, well, bring in the stuff that you're working on so that we can actually make this apply to your paper. And they never have it on time. They don't get the stuff coming in at the right time. And so I keep moving more and more towards the writing center model, where they will bring it in when they actually need help. And so it is really just in time. This really is the project that they are working on under deadline. But then I wonder if that doesn't become like the more social aspect, right? It's sort of like, this is all their affect is heightened, right then. And that's when the learning maybe happens, is when they are actually totally invested in that product right then and there. Thank you. That's all.
Oh, that's great. I feel like that same theme has come up in it's something I think a lot about, like this sort of idea of just like activity, learning within an activity versus sort of intentional learning. It's a real problem for schools and for writing education, I think, broadly. That it's hard to make visible that learning when students aren't really looking to make that learning visible, versus like, I'm doing something and I need to produce this thing to get that other thing, right? And that's when I'm learning. And I feel like a lot of us at this conference have been kind of grappling with that. Sandra, you might have been kind of touching on that a little bit in your presentation. Maybe you were mentioning kind of a lot of co-curricular stuff, I think, or extracurricular things. And that's also part of, I think, that experiential learning, the affordances of those experiential learning opportunities.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. And
I don't have anything to add to that. I think you said better just now what I was trying to say. So thank you.
By the way,
I'm struggling to articulate things at this conference, I think.
Your metaphor of the Sagrada Familia for a WAC program, I think, is amazing.
Oh, good. Thank you. My husband said I was crazy, so actually I'm really glad to hear that.
I was glad I was muted when you showed the scaffolding, because I laughed very hard out loud.
Good. I wanted people to laugh a little bit at that too.
And all the adornments, even though I didn't hear your talk, Sandra, I can imagine it.
Yeah.
I was arguing that it's the unfinished cathedral, like the unfinished WAC program was sort of the simplistic metaphor, but then I got going a little bit with metaphors. So, and I actually have to leave now, and I'm really sorry to actually go at like the witching hour, but I have a student that I'm going to meet. So, but this was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And I look forward to seeing all of you, hopefully in sessions tomorrow and also at future WAC conferences and reading what you have to say, because this really is truly exciting work. And I'm really going to be thinking about listening when I should be listening to the student who's about to zoom into me.
Yeah.
So.